today's webinar on responding to the fiscal year 2018 Second Chance Act Adult Reentry and Employment Strategic Planning Program Solicitation. My name is Sherry Moses, and I'm a policy analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Before we begin, I have a couple of technical notes. If you encounter connection or audio problems during this webinar, please call WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239. We'll also post that number on the chat box on your screen. Unfortunately, there are some connection issues that we may not be able to resolve during the webinar. However, we're recording today's webinar, and it'll be posted on our website along with a copy of the slides used in today's presentation. Everyone who registers for the webinar will receive an email as soon as the webinar is available on our website. And you can also check the website directly at csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. At the end of today's webinar, we'll have time for questions from the audience. To ask a question, please enter it in the Q&A panel on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You can ask questions at any point during the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer as many as possible before we end today. I'd like to welcome today's speakers, Andre Bethea, Policy Advisor at the Bureau of Justice Assistance, U.S. Department of Justice, and Erica Nelson, my colleague and policy analyst at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Andre?
Thanks, Sherry. At BJA, our mission is to provide leadership and services in grants administration and criminal justice policy development to state, local, and tribal jurisdictions. Specifically, BJA provides funding to support law enforcement, combat violent and drug-related crime, and combat victimization. Through the development and implementation of policy, services, and sound grants management, BJA strengthens the nation's criminal justice system and restores security in communities. The Second Chance Act has supported over $300 million in reentry services since it was passed in 2008. We are excited to speak with potential reentry and employment strategic planning grantees on how to build a competitive grant application. Now, I will turn it over to Sherry Moses to provide some information on the Council of State Governments Justice Center and the National Reentry Resource Center.
Thank you, Andre. The Council of State Governments Justice Center provides practical, nonpartisan, research-driven strategies and tools to increase public safety and strengthen communities. Please sign up for our newsletters at the address listed on the screen and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. The National Reentry Resource Center website is a great resource for grantees and the field at large. You'll find a directory of our latest projects, resources, facts and trends, and items in the news. Each topic page provides links to recent research and publications and news clips about that subject. The NRRC regularly hosts webinars on a wide variety of topics related to reentry, and all webinars are recorded, archived, and available on our website. You can find these distance learning tools under Resources. Also under Resources, you can find publications. The NRRC is building a large online library of publications related to reentry, and to date, there are over 1,200 items in our library. Through the search box on our site, you can access our publications as well as any other publications in the library. The Justice Center is also home to several projects, such as the Reentry and Employment Project and the What Works in Reentry Clearinghouse. The Employment Project is rooted in working with business leaders, policymakers, and practitioners across the country working in corrections and workforce, collaborating on the goals of improving reentry and employment outcomes for people with criminal histories. The Clearinghouse is a one-stop shop for research on the effectiveness of a wide variety of reentry programs and practices developed in partnership with the Urban Institute. The goal of the Adult Reentry and Employment Strategic Planning Program solicitation is to fund the development of strategic plans that are comprehensive, collaborative, and multi-systemic in their approach to increase public safety by reducing recidivism and improving employability for people returning to the community from incarceration. And now I'm going to turn it over to Erica.
Thanks, Sherry. I'm so excited to be speaking with you today about this grant opportunity. So the question is, so how do you build the skills necessary for the labor market and reduce the likelihood of reoffending? You do this by bridging and integrating best practices from corrections and workforce development fields, which is a focus of this grant program. In 2013, the Integrated Reentry and Employment Strategies, or IRES for short, white paper was published. With the support of the U.S. Department of Justice, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and with guidance from the U.S. Department of Labor, we brought together policymakers, practitioners, and researchers from corrections, reentry, and workforce development to strategize on how to implement evidence-based, best, and promising practices from corrections and workforce development fields, maximize limited resources, break the cycle of reincarceration and or joblessness, and ultimately prepare people with criminal histories for success. The Integrated Reentry Employment Strategies, or IRES framework, is heavily based on risk, need, and responsivity, or as we call R&R principles. The diagram shown is the Resource Allocation and Service Matching tool, which utilizes a validated criminogenic risk and needs assessment to group people by risk to reoffend. So you'll see in the green the lower risk, and in the red, the moderate to high risk. And it couples it with the Job Readiness Assessment Screening tool to group people by readiness for work. The results of both of these assessments are used to recommend the delivery of targeted and integrated employment interventions. What types of employment interventions are offered should be based on a participant's level of job readiness. Employment programs for this population, for those who with criminal histories or returning from incarceration, generally aim to achieve two broad goals: either connecting people to employment, which is helping them find and retain employment, and that's why more job-ready individuals, or either getting people ready for work, and that's for our less job-ready grouping. For people who are more ready for employment, the services provided should focus on job development, coaching, job retention, and advancement. For people who are less ready for work, employment services should focus on soft skill development and supportive employment, such as transitional jobs. The hope is that people that are less ready for work will move into more job-ready grouping as time progresses. Now, the factors that put someone at a higher risk to reoffend can have a significant impact on employability. Therefore, beyond what types of services are provided, agencies must also consider how services are delivered to impact recidivism. These efforts include engaging people in programming, the timing of services, incentives provided, coordination with other support, and the use of structured pro-social activities. To develop integrated responses that will improve outcomes for people returning from incarceration, corrections agencies that conduct risk and needs assessments should identify ways to share assessment information as well as other pertinent information with reentry and workforce development agencies, and develop collaborative, coordinated case planning with employment service providers and other reentry service providers. So let's take a look at what this looks like in practice. You're an agency that provides employment services, and you have two individuals come through your door. Joseph and Michael are about the same age. They have a felony conviction and a high school educational equivalent. By conducting a risk need assessment, we find that their risk and associated needs differ. Joseph has no prior conviction, whereas Michael has 3. Joseph maintained family ties, and Michael has a history of substance abuse. Although I'm sure there's much more information we could gather about Joseph and Michael based on their assessments, from the information we have, we can assume that Joseph is at a lower risk to reoffend and Michael is at a higher risk to reoffend. We then layer in a job readiness screening to learn more about their employability. And we discovered that Joseph was employed at the time of arrest. However, Michael was not. Joseph worked in correctional industries while incarcerated, and Michael has gaps in his employment history and limited skills. From this information, we can assume that Joseph is more ready for employment and Michael is less ready. So through intake, conducting a risk and needs assessment, and job readiness screening, we discovered that the needs are different. Thus, their services should differ. For Joseph, we were focused on job attainment and retention, perhaps higher education or credentialing to move him along a career pathway. For Michael, he will need intensive engagement and structure, soft skills development, and perhaps a subsidized employment service like a transitional job program where he could build skills while earning an income for his participation in a program. In 2005, the National Reentry Resource Center began piloting this client matching model on a systems level in Palm Beach County, Florida, and Milwaukee County, Wisconsin. And even more specifically, we were trying to figure out what works to make better connections to employment services pre- and post-release based on the individual's assessed needs. We gathered a lot of information during this 3-year project. During the first year, we conducted a data analysis to identify the risk needs of people returning to both counties. We held meetings with correctional institution staff, community-based employment providers, and supervision agents to understand who was providing what services and how. And we reviewed a lot of documentation outlining the processes and policies for how someone moves through the criminal justice system and back into the community. In the second year of the project, we actually presented findings and recommendations to streamline the reentry planning process to lead stakeholders in both pilot sites and quickly began working with the sites to implement recommendations proposed. At the month of implementation, we learned a lot. But there were 4 key areas we found necessary to implementing a collaborative and coordinated approach to ensure that the right people are connected to the right interventions at the right time in their reentry planning process. 1, you have to have buy-in from leadership, and that's across all systems, as well as direct line staff. 2, risk needs assessments and job readiness screenings need to be conducted in a timely fashion. 3, we have to have an understanding of the landscape of the services available pre-release and post-release, including the capacity to provide services. And 4, we have to learn about the coordinated process for making referrals and tracking outcomes. So they have to have those things in place. We actually are currently wrapping up the 3rd year of the project, which is the process evaluation. We hope to produce a report of our findings early this year. You can find more information about the Integrated Reentry and Employment Strategies Project on our NRC website, and the link to that website is included in this presentation on this slide, as well as in our resource slides, which you'll find at the end of the presentation. Now I'll turn it over to Andre to talk about eligibility, requirements, and deliverables for this grant program. Andre?
Thanks, Erica. Eligible applicants are limited to state correctional agencies, the state departments of corrections, parole, or probation, state administering agencies, that would be your SAAs, and federally recognized Indian tribes as determined by the Secretary of the Interior. BJA welcomes collaborative applications under which 2 or more entities would carry out the federal award, including corrections, parole, probation, and workforce development agencies. However, only one entity may be the applicant. Any others must be proposed as subrecipients, which are subgrantees. The applicant must be the entity that would have primary responsibility for carrying out the award, including administering the funding and managing the entire project. Under this solicitation, only one application by any particular applicant entity will be considered. An entity may, however, be proposed as a subrecipient, subgrantee, and more than one application. Now we're going to go over the mandatory requirements. Each applicant must establish a cross-disciplinary executive-level steering committee. This committee should align its priorities with the efforts of the cross-disciplinary working group, including opportunities to identify and address policy and programmatic barriers to successful employment after reentry, and align funding to support best practices in reentry and employment. Establishing a cross-disciplinary working group. This group should comprise of relevant state-level officials, tribal, territorial, or local leaders, and representatives of relevant agencies, service providers, nonprofit organizations, and other key stakeholders to guide the strategic planning process. This group should include criminal justice stakeholder participation, including corrections, parole, probation, and reentry service providers, and workforce development stakeholder participation, including the state and local workforce investment boards, employment and training service providers, and community colleges and employers. Letters of support from correctional officials, workforce development, and community-based reentry organizations should be included in the application. BJA acknowledges that some states will utilize existing reentry council or task forces for the working group or steering committee. Chairs of the working group should represent the workforce development and correctional systems. Priorities of this group should include opportunities to identify and address state and local barriers to effective reentry and successful employment. This group will lead up a comprehensive process analysis and systems mapping to identify the processes for assessing criminogenic risk needs to reoffend and job readiness needs, and identify the processes associated with making program referrals in the correctional facilities and in the community. It must also identify the processes associated with sharing information and transition planning. Also, inventory existing service capacity in the correctional facility and in the community, as well as programs alignment with best practices. In addition, applicants will also be required to create an industry advisory group of employer to advise on program development and help promote direct connections to employment. The applicant must describe the process for establishing and regularly engaging the industry advisory group of employers. The advisory group must include amongst its membership business leaders from a specific growth industry in that region. Applicants must describe the rationale for selecting the industry, include a description of the advisory group's priorities, which should include opportunities to develop job training programs that align with the industry's hiring needs and industry-recognized credentials, and identify and address state, local, and tribal barriers to accessing and advancing in the employment in that industry. Applicants must also develop a strategic plan for integrating the best practices from the corrections and workforce development fields to build the capacity of or establish new correctional and community-based education and employment programs aimed to reduce recidivism and improve employment outcomes amongst the most likely to recidivate. System and funding should align with this plan. Now we're going to shift to the deliverables for this grant, which should include a strategic plan. And that strategic plan should address gaps in services or systems based on the results of the comprehensive process analysis and systems mapping. The plan can speak to improving existing program quality and developing new job training and education interventions. The plan can also speak to ensuring service contracts reflect evidence-based principles and promising practices. The strategic plan should also support coordinated transition and release planning using formal partnerships and data sharing agreements. Include process and outcome evaluations efforts to add to the field's knowledge about what works to improve employment and recidivism outcomes. The plan should describe how efforts could be replicated or brought to scale if demonstrated to be effective. This can include staff training and leverage private, local, state, tribal, and/or federal resources to support sustainability. And now we're going to discuss the target population. The target population for the program should include people incarcerated in the state correctional facilities who are releasing to an identified local geographic area within 6 to 36 months. Participants must be moderate to high risk to reoffending as identified using a validated risk needs assessment tool. Also, age 18 and older, and convicted as adults. OJP strongly emphasizes the use of data and evidence in policymaking and program development in criminal justice, juvenile justice, and crime victim services. OJP is committed to improving the quantity and quality of evidence OJP generates, integrating evidence into program practice and policy decisions within OJP in the field, improving the translation of evidence into practice. OJP considers programs and practices to be evidence-based when their effectiveness has been demonstrated by causal evidence, generally obtained through one or more outcome evaluations. Causal evidence documents a relationship between an activity or intervention, including technology, and its intended outcome, including measuring the direction and size of a change and the extent to which a change may be attributed to the activity or the intervention. Causal evidence depends on the use of scientific methods to rule out, to the extent possible, alternative explanations for the documented change. The strength of causal evidence, based on the factors described above, will influence the degree to which OJP considers a program or practice to be evidence-based. Please consult the OJPCrimesolutions.gov website. Applicants may use this to find information about evidence-based programs in criminal justice, juvenile justice, and crime victim services. Now some further information about the award itself. This fiscal year 2018 solicitation will provide funding for 6 12-month adult reentry and employment strategic planning program grants to begin October 1, 2018, up to $200,000 each. Applicants must develop strategic plans and complete planning and implementation guide. No match is required. Then you will be considered for competitive funding for implementation in a future solicitation. Again, this solicitation does not require a match. However, if a successful application proposes a voluntary match amount and the Office for Justice Programs approves the budget, the total match amount is incorporated into the approved budget, which becomes mandatory and subject to audit. For additional information, consult the Department of Justice Grants Financial Guide at the website that you see on the screen. Pre-agreement costs are costs incurred by the applicant prior to the start of the period of the performance of the federal award. OJP does not typically approve pre-agreement costs. An applicant must request and obtain the prior written approval from the Office of Justice Programs for all such costs. All such costs incurred prior to award and prior to approval of costs are incurred at the sole risk of the applicant. Again, please consult the Department of Justice Grants Financial Guide at the website that you see on the screen. Prior approval, planning, and reporting of conference, meeting, and training costs. The Office of Justice Program encourages minimization of conference, meeting, and training costs. These costs require prior written approval. OJP sets limits, which include a general prohibition of all food and beverage costs. OJP strongly encourages every applicant that proposes to use awards funds for any conference meeting or training-related activity or similar event to review the OJP and Department of Justice policy and guidance on approval, planning, and reporting of such events. This can be found within the financial guide, specifically at the website that's listed on the screen. Each application should include information to complete the application for federal assistance, which is the SF-424 form, a project abstract, program narrative including a statement of the problem, project design and implementation, capabilities and competencies, and plan for collecting the data required for the solicitation's performance measures, budget and associated documentation, indirect cost rate agreement if applicable, tribal authorizing resolution, financial management and system of internal controls questionnaire, including applicant disclosure of high-risk status, disclosure of any lobbying activities, additional statements including but not limited to the letter from applicant agency executive demonstrating the agency's commitment to the strategic planning period, a program timeline, position descriptions for key roles, resumes for key personnel, letters of support, applicant disclosure of pending federal funding applications, and research and evaluation, independence and integrity. Here, you'll find the review criteria for grant applications. A full list of requirements can be found in the solicitation. Now I'll turn it over to Erica to share additional resources and close out the webinar for today.
Thank you, Andre. For more information about this solicitation, please visit www.eja.gov/SCA EMP18. Applications are due on June 18, 2018. If you are having any trouble with submitting your application, please contact grant.gov. The information, including the phone number as well as email address and website, is located on the slide. If you have any questions or need assistance regarding the solicitation, please contact the National Criminal Justice Reference Service Response Center. The website as well as the contact information is included in the slide showing. To learn more about the information that was shared in today's presentation, please take a look at the resources on the slide presented. For information about best and promising and evidence-based practices, please visit crimesolutions.org. For information about the Council of State Governments Justice Center Reentry and Employment Program, please take a look at the website presented to you at csgjusticecenter.org/NRC Reentry and Employment. For information about the Integrated Reentry and Employment Strategies Project, which was mentioned very early on in this presentation, please also visit the NRC website where you'll get full information on progress of the sites as well as those recommendations that were shared to implement a more coordinated reentry and planning process. So that concludes the presentation portion of this webinar. Let's take some time now to open it up for questions and answers. Okay. So often when we get or have these type of webinars, one of the questions that is constantly proposed is, how soon should applicants expect to be informed about their award? Andre, do you have like an estimation of kind of when an applicant will be notified?
Sure. So applicants that receive the grant award will be notified before October 1, 2018. Again, applicants that are awarded the grant will be notified via email prior to October 1, 2018.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Andre. We do have a question. Can you elaborate how nonprofits administering reentry and workforce development services are eligible for the grant?
You want me to handle that, or you got it?
Andre, you can talk about it, and I can jump in as well.
Well, the lead applicant is supposed to be the government agency, and the nonprofit or workforce group would partner together. We are hoping that the steering committee being established would suggest who may be the salient voice to be the lead applicant, and that other partners would be in support of the initiative. It's sort of a systems alignment piece that the steering committee would establish many of the goals and priorities, and together with the government agencies, the nonprofit providers, the workforce development and workforce boards, and of course, the separate business leaders group will work together Erica, you want to give more insight on how that unique collaboration kind of plays out in the local form?
Yeah, so if the state entity or the state correctional system applies, they would select a jurisdiction that they plan to work with. So as you know, state entities, state correctional systems vary all over, different counties. So they would select a county or a city where people will be returning to, and they would generally partner with that those entities that are in the community. So those reentry organizations, the workforce board or workforce agencies, the local colleges that are there. So that's how it would work in terms of that partnership. We have another question. Are the development of the committees, including identified personnel, be included within the grant? So the answer to that is yes. As Andre mentioned, there are two committees that need to be established, the steering committee as well as the working group. The personnel should be identified in terms of who would be a part of those committees and what their role would be, and how often that committee would meet, what are the priorities of that committee, and everyone should have some insight and input on that, on those items, as well as what is included in your strategic plan. We have another question. Can you please describe specifically what would identify as a state administering agency? Andre, I'll ask you to share what are SAAs. Hello?
Hello?
Hi, Andre, do you want to share what SAAs are, state administering agencies?
Sure. Each state under the governor will have a state administrating agency. And so it could be a body of persons that are at the cabinet level. It could be one individual. All states handle it differently. Or it could be a whole set-aside office that is a subdivision of the executive team surrounding the governor. So in many cases, the SAA would be planted or will be a part of the executive team at the governor's level. And if anyone is having any trouble or issues trying to identify who that person is, then chances are you should consult the office of your commissioner or your director or your leader at the cabinet level to identify who is setting the agenda for your governor.
Thank you, Andre, for explaining that. So another question that's often proposed is about recidivism and calculations of baseline rates. Often we hear, is it necessary for the baseline rate to be listed on the application when defining it? Andre, would you say that that's something that should be listed in the application?
Yes, Erica. I'm encouraging all applicants to consider that this initiative is to build systems alignment as jurisdictions think holistically and realistically about reentry and employment. And at the core of it would be a reduction in the state or the jurisdiction's baseline recidivism rate. So it's incumbent upon each applicant to not only define recidivism as it is determined in their state or in their jurisdiction, and provide a baseline recidivism rate, in addition to which year was the study conducted that determined that baseline recidivism rate.
Awesome. And as you mentioned, Andre, I know a lot of times in terms of recidivism and the calculation, it can vary, whether it's rearrest, reconviction, reincarceration. Does the Department of Justice provide any guidance on the selection of what that definition is, or does it really fall onus on the state to define?
Great question. The onus is on the state and the jurisdiction to define recidivism and to suggest where that number is being calculated or where the count is being calculated. So specifically, I mean state recidivism, say the word recidivism, but also put the milestone. Is it rearrest? Is it reincarceration? Is it reoffense? Is it violation? That'd be the case of probation and parole. All of those different milestones could be a part of the definition. However, the Department of Justice does not provide any guidance on the definition of recidivism. That is built within the state jurisdiction and thus should be stated by the applicant.
Awesome. Thank you, Andre. So we have a question regarding the deliverables and describing them in the application. The question is, are we to describe how we develop a strategic plan and address these items, or are you expecting in plan to carry out?
We're not limiting any jurisdiction. We are appealing to both of those suggestions. Every state and every jurisdiction is at a different step in this process. Some states are further along in their thinking and have already provoked a different discussion about reentry and employment. Others might have a reentry steering committee that is just at the tip of this discussion. So we're not excluding anyone. We will encompass all who are willing to think differently about reentry and employment. That's why this particular grant program is only $200,000, because there will be training and technical assistance provided by the National Reentry Resource Center to help your jurisdiction move the needle on this particular conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Andre. So we have a question. There is a participant who's a federally recognized tribe, and they say that their state does not currently track recidivism rates for Native Americans. What data would BJA consider as filling this gap?
That particular federally recognized Indian tribe or Native American community would have a discussion with the state correction department that is also within their jurisdiction to help determine what that number looks like. There is a number, and it is best that you consult with correction leaders within that particular jurisdiction to identify what that particular data includes.
Yeah, I agree. There is data, whether or not there's a report that has been developed to state for each category or nationality who's recidivating may not be developed, but there should be some sort of data. And I agree, Andre, connecting with your state agencies or other jurisdictions that track criminal justice information would be helpful. So we have another question. Is the analysis and mapping to be completed as part of the grant proposal process or as a deliverable for the grant? And I would say, if I respond to that, that it's actually a deliverable for the grant. Okay, another question. What are some examples of the type of change in the target population that should be measured? And I'm wondering if this question is more in relation in terms of, I guess, what are some outcomes you're looking as a part of the strategic plan that you, some of the areas that you hope to address. And if this is, I guess, the question that's being asked, I would say in terms of employment outcomes, recidivism, and other reentry outcomes. Andre, are there any other things that they should be thinking about in terms of measurement of change?
At this point, that's what the steering committee should be discussing. We're not in any position to build the grant proposal for you. So I think that's a conversation that you will have amongst the steering committee that is that will be thinking differently and be responding to the solicitation.
Okay. So we do have another question, but it's not quite clear. So it mentioned, are there files and documentation that will need to be maintained for a period of time? I would add to that that at the end of the solicitation, there is a chart that talks about the measurements and performance measures that will be tracked. I would refer back to that chart that's in the tail end of the solicitation, and it provides some information regarding those files or any documentation that needs to be maintained. Okay. So I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box. However, if there are any additional questions that you have, maybe it didn't come to you during the time of this webinar, I would suggest just shooting us an email, and we could try to address those questions as they come. So if there's no more questions, this concludes the webinar. I want to thank Sherry Moses and Andre Badia for taking the time to speak today about this exciting new funding opportunity. And I want to thank everyone who joined us today and submitted questions. As Sherry mentioned before, you should receive an email with a link to a survey asking for your feedback. Please take a moment to fill this out. It actually is used to help us to continue to improve the resources we provide to the field. We will also be emailing a link to the recording of this presentation, as well as a link to the PDF PowerPoint slides that was used in this presentation in the coming weeks. The link will also be made available on the National Reentry Resource Center website at csgjusticecenter.org/NRRC. I also encourage you to sign up for the newsletter, which you'll see on the slide in front of you at csgjusticecenter.org/subscribe. I want to thank you again for joining today's webinar. Have a great day.